so with this country's concentration of wealth and income that we hear about every day. That's a subject Albert asked me to talk about specifically, so I will. We do live in, it's true, in a new gilded age. The income of the top 1% is about 20% of national income, and the top 1% hold about 40% of the net worth of the country. And the 20% is roughly double what it was at the end of the 1970s, at the end of decades of shared prosperity in the country. During the war, when lots of poor blacks who had never been employed before came into the workforce for the defense effort at home, and after that, during the 50s and 60s, that shared prosperity continued. The 40% share is also pretty high. It's also been on the rise since the 1970s, when it hit bottom, after a long slide that started at the beginning of the Great Depression. The down and up pattern in the share of the top 1% of the country in assets reflects the down and up of the stock market. Not surprising, because it's wealthy people who dominantly own common shares. What's more significant, though, than what's happening at the top is what's happening in the middle and the bottom. Since the 1970s, there's been negligible increases in real income in both income brackets. And this is despite the fact that the economy is about 4 times as big as it was in the late 70s. And despite the fact that the growth in productivity in the economy during that time, to a large extent, should have redounded to later to the broad middle classes of the society. I would say that in part, this result can be traced to Wall Street, but I'd emphasize in part. The Morgan of old that I knew now functions in a world of hedge funds, venture capital, and private equity. All of them financial institutions that tend to view the objective of a firm very narrowly. They look at a firm through the prism of the share price or some other measure of market value, pretty much to the exclusion of all other objectives. And I would say all other objectives, including the welfare of the workforce. If employee costs in salaries or benefits or pensions or whatever can be cut, and profits can be raised as a result, that firm today becomes much less of a target for a takeover. Management has less risk of an outsider and potentially disruptive board member, and best of all, from the perspective of the corner office, those old stock options now mean multi-million-dollar paydays. This kind of, some would call it vulture capitalism, so differs from the Morgan that I knew in the 70s and the 80s. I believe what caused the bank to outsource the low-skilled workforce that we had, and there were thousands of them, just as it caused many other old line employers to do the same, was basically the advent of a shift from focusing on many objectives of the bank to focusing only on next quarters and the quarters after that's income statement. The Lithuanian women who cleaned the bathrooms when I worked there, by the time I had retired, had been outsourced. And they were no longer beneficiaries like the rest of us of profit sharing, vacation time, and pension benefits. All of those went away. I said earlier that Wall Street's only a part of the problem. There are many other, or part of the issue, if you will, many other sources of why we have had a top 1% that has doubled the income and much more of the wealth than was the case 40, 50 years ago. One is the rapid rise in the labor force participation rate of women. And not just any women, but highly educated and talented women who in years past had stayed home to raise a family. There's natural selection in love, as in many other things in life. You can think of lots of exceptions, and we all can, but talented and highly educated women tend to marry talented and highly educated men. And you can, but the sociologists tell us, even with the exceptions, that that's approximately true. So the working couple, which in 1970 was two people at low income working in the mill, by 1980 was also the woman pediatrician and the investor banker husband, two high incomes, not one, as before. The second causal factor is the interaction of globalization and technology. 100 years ago, an especially talented tenor got the take of the hall minus the expenses. But now he gets, plus royalties galore from CD sales, payments from endorsements, even the advertising revenue that comes from the sweatshirts that carry his name on the front. The market for the tenor singing, by the way, and everything that goes with it, all those ancillary income streams, is now global and now digitized and to boot influenced by countries like Japan, where the appetite for tenors is limited to tenor number one, capital T, capital N, capital O. I exaggerate to be sure, but I just want to emphasize the reason why today a Pavarotti can become a very rich man, and yet you have a tenor who's almost as good, making his living singing in the subway. I could have said second baseman or whiz kid CFO, and the story would be the same. Robert Frank put it best in the title of his book, Robert Frank of Cornell, The Winner Take All Society. Finally, there's the globalization itself, which to a considerable extent is the result of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the ensuing collapse of the Soviet Union. The failure of the Soviet model turned heads in many developing countries where a shadow of the Soviet model existed for many years. The rapid rise of once very poor countries brought home to us Americans, to our dismay and astonishment actually, that brains and talent were sprinkled sort of randomly throughout the world and not just dumped here on our shores, which is what many of us came to believe after World War II, when most of the rest of the world was still flat on its back. When the Iron Curtain fell, the advanced countries of the world had already caught up, but it was at that time that the once poor and backward countries began to catch up as well. Fast forward 20 years and we have automobiles produced in Mexico. GM is there, Volkswagen is there, and there's no such thing as a German car or an American car, only country labels for the cars. The supply chains are integrated, and if equality has grown in this country, and it's very hard to dispute the statistics that it has, just the opposite has happened around the world, where there is a growing equality brought on to a large extent by the export of capital from high-income countries like the United States. If anyone has a good idea as to where to find God on a Wall Street or any other specific place or institution, Albert is going to give you his pulpit next Sunday. But what we all can do is ponder how those two gospel teachings, which I mentioned at the start, play out in our own lives. How willing am I to accept that many in this, the richest of all countries, have no access to health care except on an emergency basis in a hospital emergency room? How do I look at the unemployed UAW members in Toledo or Detroit? How do I look at the Mexican auto worker, although not my countryman, is a fellow human being? And even closer to home, how do I look at the Mexican gardener who's trying to feed his kids and make a living 15 miles from here, and at the same time escape the clutches of ice? In short, in this complicated global village we all live in, who is my neighbor in the New Testament sense of the word? If more and more of us can give reasonably good and Christian answers to questions like these and many others, maybe we wouldn't have such a hard time finding God on Wall Street, or Main Street, or anywhere else for that matter. John, you're next.
Well, I'm not sure how you do that, though. I've been trying to be a camel for ages, but I can't get through the... But that's untrue. I mean, we, sitting here in Millbrook, we're amongst the 1%, if not of the country, certainly of the world. So we should give great thanks for that. And I think the other... I was wondering whether we shouldn't change the title of these talks and say, whereas it's a bit tough to find God, but it's pretty easy to find Goldman. Oh, and that gets back to what Walter was just saying. There's not only an inequality, there's not only a change, there are very few, and there's tons of it. I'll get to that in a minute. We're going to run out of time, so I'm going to pretty much read this. I don't believe that Christ ever drew up an organization chart. And I don't think he had a strategic plan, at least it isn't written. But he did work off the 10 Commandments, and we certainly have 2 from the Sermon of the Mount. And it's pretty simple. Love God and do unto others. Uh-oh, hang on. Who, what, where is God? And I think we know who the others are. And he never had an HR strategy. Didn't talk about human relations. In fact, I've always worried about the parable of the vineyard. I mean, you show up at the end of the day and you get as much as the chap who's been there all year. There's no performance review at all. Everyone's going to get the share options and come on. It sort of doesn't work. And I was struck, I ran across Ecclesiastes 5:10. Whoever loves money never has money enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income or her income. This is meaningless. And it sounds to me something which I rabbit on all the time. The problem that we have, enough is never sufficient. I mean, holy moly, how can these lads count the amounts of money that they have? I mean, 3 meals a day is enough for most people, and 5 or 6 houses is, where do you leave your socks? Come on. And what about the love of God? So today we're trying to discuss just where he is, and we're going to try and discuss what we want from others. Well, we're told, the boys on Wall Street would tell us that capitalism is all about competition. Rubbish. Capitalism is about acquiring and increasing capital. That's why it's called capitalism. Oh, hello, and with capital goes power. And with power goes, whether you want to pick up grinding the masses or whatever, but the more power you have, the less there is for others and the more you can get. It's a fairly simple model. Adam Smith called it the invisible hand. Well, the evangelicals might claim that it's God's hand. I would not at all. So what about doing unto others? God is about Christianity and about sharing. God is looking after the meek and the poor. And his offer, his reward is, it's not a bunch of funds, it's grace. Oh, come on, guys. Wall Street's not into grace. And it's given and not earned. Just a minute. I'm in charge of HR. Hey, chaps, just show up. Here's your It doesn't work that way on Wall. It doesn't work that way in corporations. It's an entirely different model. Capitalism is about capital and acquiring and taking for others before they take it from you. Economics 101 tells you about perfect competition. It's assumed to result in perfect allocation of resources to assure a perfect allocation of goods. Oh, good. Wrong. In fact, the real world is a ruthless competition for the seizing of rents via the achievement of oligopolistic and monopolistic positions of power. Capitalism is about scarcity and competition for the surplus. Capitalism's offer, Christ's offer, is grace. Capitalism's offer is the acquisition of surplus. Economics, as I say, assumes that profits must be earned, and surplus can be accumulated. Power can and should accrue to such surplus. I own it, it's mine, you got it, you shouldn't have it. If you've got it, you must have taken it from me. Enough is never sufficient. God assumes that grace can be given, that property is immaterial. Remember, Christ had no place to lay his head. What? He wasn't acquiring land and a couple of real estate. It is so simple that it's, and we rabbit it. Albert doesn't rabbit it, but we talk about these things and we say, oh yes, that sounds pretty good. Next, now I wonder how my portfolio is doing. It is such a different approach that we accept it on the one hand and then we live our Wall Street lives on the other. I'll give you two biblical quotes and the Greek derivation of the word economics. Exodus. If you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not be like the moneylender, charge him no interest. Yeah, that's going to get you a big bonus at the end of your Wall Street day. Charge him no interest. Oh, really? Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, and to God that which is God's. We all know that. Does this mean just worldly things to Caesar and the other rabbity stuff can go to God? Is it render unto Goldman what's worldly and only the other stuff to God? We're also told that it's just about taxes, but we're also told that it's actually about civics. And so render the stuff that you have to and the legal stuff that you have to, get that organised, and then with what's left. I mean, that is, and yet these are the ones that if you ask us, and the chaps who don't think about it a whole lot, those are a couple of quotes that we would come up with quite quickly. Do we live them? I don't know, you've got to ask for yourself. I think it's better, the way that we take it is give a minimum, or rather what Christ was saying was give the minimum to Caesar. There's no point in getting out and getting crucified every day, and then put the rest of your lives, the main part of your lives, to where? Well, the second part of the Sermon on the Mount was to look after other people. Remember, well, you probably won't remember, I didn't, I had to find it. The word economics comes from the Greek ekos, the household, and nomos, the law. And it means we ought to be sharing wisely within and for the household. But just a minute, I said before, economics is about scarcity and trading off goods and services and putting a price on them. But you can't put a price on parenting. You can't put a price on children or education or your association with others. So, come on. The market rules, okay? You can put a price on everything. And you can organize the surplus for yourself. Well, where is God in the market society? If all life is merely a market exchange, a commodity exchange, then obviously the man with the most commodities wins. And that's the way the world works. But labour has no scarcity value. And that's becoming even more so now as AI and other bits take off what we thought we could get with our heads. But we're told that God sets succor for the poor and the meek, those outside the fruits of the market economy. And ideally, God is not about scarcity, but about plenty and distribution. But how to achieve that plenty? Well, our Wall Street people will do it for us. Our corporate people will do it for us. But the poor and the meek and labour are powerless. And if capital is king, capital rules, and surplus, as I said before, leads to power, and we know where that leads. I would ask to see if we could run up a couple of personal examples, and I've got a couple here. Of course, they wind up with me being the hero, so you'll have to ignore that. When I was and I should have said I was an agricultural economist. I got into strategic planning. I got into management. I was in India and Bangladesh and was in general management, and then was back to strategic planning and first with WR Grace, and then with the Flag, and then with Colgate. And I think that most of my career was with Colgate. I think that most of my career was consisted of inducing people to buy a fine product, most of which they then spat down the basin. You'd say, well, that was a pretty impressive piece of operation, wasn't it? The neat thing about that was, well, maybe not WR Grace, but at both Pfizer when I was there and at Colgate when I was there, we had men of integrity and dignity and decency running those companies, and I believe, and maybe it's pink-eyed or pink glasses hindsight, that culture went through the company, and I think that's, if I can get this reason that we made some reasonably good decisions. One was, when I was running the company in the UK, I got a phone call late one night, and there's a sort of voice on the thing. It says, the poor kitty died. What? And it turned out that this chap had claimed to have taken a truckload of our product, toothpaste, and had adulterated it with highly active poison. He'd tested it on a cat, the cat had died, and he'd put it out, and if we didn't come up with a whole bunch of funds that night, it would be in the marketplace and all hell would break loose. And the timing, UK to here, there was no one in the office back here in New York at what to do. Oh, and don't ring the police and don't ring New York. What to do? Bit awkward. So what do you lean back on? Well, you lean back on the policies that you believe you have in the company, and what would, in this case, what would Rudy Mark have done? So I nipped in my car, drove home, and rang up the cops from home so that he couldn't. And we were now running out of time, and I got a cop down the road, and he and my car went to where we'd been told to go, and I mean, it was classic. It was Copstone movie stuff. We had to go on a bridge across an underpass and lower down the bag with all the money, no money, and there was a guy down there. When he got there, the cops came and pounced on him. Wow, but you said there'd be no cops. Okay, so that worked out well. It took tremendous heat from New York, and then they realised that we'd actually been following the policies. That you had to, one, make sure that the product was maintained. Two, that you didn't do it on your own. You went to the police, etc. So what's the learning from this? It wasn't a company that was going to buckle. It wasn't a company that was going to put the consumers at risk, etc. Lucky we had the policy. I got news for you. That was a sweaty night. My goodness. I think perhaps one more important one was when I was running the company in Bangladesh. The union secretary was a guy about half my size upwards and about 6 times my size wideways, and he'd been in charge of the Muqtabahini, the quartermaster sergeant for the Muqtabahini, the rebels in the just completed civil war. I think I was physically scared of him. I was 28, it was my first general management job. And we found out that he had been taking trucks of our very valuable product where we had to sell at a set price, taking the trucks, taking the product, flogging it because it was in great short supply, getting a tremendous increase, and then giving us the money that we ought to get. Oh my God, what to do? So I charge sheeted him, which is the first step towards going on to arrest. Well, the S hit the fans, and he took the company, took them out on strike, and now I'm sitting there. This was a Friday, and I'm sitting there with the companies on strike.